Hello, today we will make a reaction on Alt Simplified channel's topic or video topic entitled The Economy of the Philippines, Asian Tiger or Underperformer. To God be the greater glory. In a nutshell, Alt Simplified presented the following points on the Philippine economy with the title The Economy of the Philippines, Asian Tiger or Underperformer. Using much of the data possibly coming from the IMF, World Bank, and other institutional agencies, Alt Simplified zeroed in on the following points. Number one, that the Philippine economy has the second highest GDP per capita next to Japan after the Second World War. Number two, that the Philippines has the second most modern manufacturing sector, also next to Japan, after the Second World War. Number three, that the Philippines was supposedly the first Asian tiger back then that has since fallen from the Asian tiger race in the years that followed. Number four, that the Philippines was an economy that suffered from a debt default since the 1980s but has since slowly recovered. 5. That it has poorly executed its economic reforms agenda, contributing to it lagging behind its neighbors in terms of attracting foreign direct investment. 6. That it has suffered from many political assassinations and unrest, contributing to its unattractiveness in the past. 7. That it is the worst performer among its peers in 2020. Alt Simplified tried to dissect and answer what was behind this sluggish performance by listing down 7 main reasons, which are: number one, the Philippines had a high political instability in its own history. 2 is that it has a long history of protectionism and import substitution after the Second World War. 3. The general decline in the price of its key imports in the years that followed after the Second World War. 4. That it only opened some sectors of its economy in the 1960s and 1970s, but it produced worse results because it hurt its own industries that flourished due to import substitution because of the high tariff imposed on capital goods needed to produce new export-oriented industries. 5. The economy started heavy borrowing in the 1970s, jump-starting the country's dependence on foreign debt to finance its growth. 6. By the early 80s, investors started capital flight, resulting on the debt payment default, thus stunting its own growth, missing the so-called Asian tiger mark in the years that followed. 7. And finally, in all these things, protectionism as a state policy never really went away, or the country never really got rid of protectionism as an economic policy. Now, having all these concepts and policies and events stated, it brings us to the question, are these things presented and listed by Alt Simplified really true, or did they really happen? Well, the answer to Alt Simplified's presentation on the Philippine economy, specifically concerning the major points he presented, is that some of them are true, but then Some of them are also lies. In discussing what are the truths and what are the lies in Alt Simplified's presentation of the main points concerning the Philippine economy, it is best to finish his presentation with the remaining minor points he made and then make an appreciation of them as well. And so, accordingly, there are 6 minor points that Alt Simplified presented that characterizes the Philippine economy. These factors or aspects are: first, he stated that the Philippines took on a different model or different uh, model of economic development from the usual agricultural economy to the growth of the manufacturing sector, and finally to the creation of the services sector. The Philippines apparently took a different model in the sense that before it can even develop its manufacturing sector and traverse the income curve, the service sector grew rapidly without making a dent on the income levels, thus making the service sector the largest sector in the economy by the 1980s. And yet, by that time, the manufacturing sector could not provide the jobs needed by the people or by the society, and thus resulting to high unemployment rate. Alt Simplified attributes this again to the government's policy of protectionism. The second characteristic or aspect that Alt Simplified zeroed in concerns the Philippines' geography. He stated that, like Indonesia, which is an archipelagic state, the Philippines faces a tough challenge on the issue of transportation of goods and utilities such as electricity, thus making the price of electricity in the Philippines among the highest in the region. Add to this dilemma is the policy of the domestic protectionism, which further adds to economic deterioration. The third aspect, according to Alt Simplified, concerns the unhampered urban migration. As to this unhampered urban migration, which creates other problems such as the uneven development between urban and rural demographics, the high urban density of Manila, in fact the highest and the densiest according to the United Nations, the high composition of low-skilled service sector or low-skilled service sector workers producing high unemployment, all of which are detrimental to the economy as a whole. The fourth aspect that I'll simplify zeroed in concerns the Philippine history itself, which used to be a former U.S. colony. All Simplified stated that this is in fact positive to the Philippines because of the cultural affinity with which the Filipinos identified themselves with. It was through this cultural affinity that the business process outsourcing industry that used to be only a $1 million industry in 2003 has now grown to become a $25 billion a year industry. Although Alt Simplified still believes that the BPO industry still holds a lot of promise, but the recent trend and the development on artificial intelligence in the service sector poses a threat to it that the Philippines should address. The fifth aspect that I'll simplified zeroed in concerns the overseas remittance that comprise 9% of the economy and that 1 out of 10 Filipino work abroad as an overseas Filipino worker, and that the Philippines is the fourth world's largest supplier of overseas worker after China, India, and Mexico. Alt Simplified attributes this to the fact that the Philippine government could not provide higher wages for its own people, and that the educational system itself was designed by the government to produce workers who would fill in the global demand for cheap labor. The sixth aspect or factor that Alt-Simplified zeroed in concerns the Philippines' own natural beauty and the scenery giving way to the tourism industry, and it accounting to 12% of the country's GDP, and is ascribed as the country's future key growth area. However, because of the problems on transportation, the Philippines still lags behind among its neighbors in this field in spite it's supposed it's supposed to benefit from the middle class population of the more affluent East Asian neighbors. Now, with all these major and minor points that Al Simplified presented, we beg to ask, what are the things that he sees to be the challenges that the Philippines should focus on too, should it wish to catch up with its neighbors in the so-called Asian tiger race? In this regard, Alt Simplified identified four key challenges that the Philippines should focus on too. These are: first, that the government should simplify or ease the process of doing business in the country. In this category, the Philippines supposedly suffers from a bad reputation, ranking 95th in the world, behind its more affluent neighbors. That is, in terms of ease in doing business. Number two, that the government should strive more to attract foreign direct investment. In this regard, the Philippines also lags behind its neighbors, and again, All Simplified identifies the culprit being the policy of protectionism of the government. Number three, that the government should streamline the bureaucracy and further eliminate regulation to make it more competitive. Number four, that the government should amend the 1987 Constitution, stating it is one of the most restrictive constitutions in the region, specifically focusing on the corporate income tax, which is the highest in ASEAN, as well as the constitutional restrictions on complete foreign ownership of public utilities. Alt Simplified stated that this 1987 constitution was also the culprit behind the entrenched oligarchy in the country, which themselves are the ones who benefit most from the economy and from its protectionist policies, and are the ones behind the huge income inequality between the rural and the urban demographics of the country. This, since historically and prior to the 1990s, the income inequality in the country measured through the value of the Gini coefficient had always been the highest in the region, standing at 0.43 or 43 percentage points. And it does not help. Finally, the so-called here and now. Alt Simplified stated that the greatest loser in 2020 specifically or especially in relation to the pandemic is the Philippines. This was due to the fact that other than Argentina, the Philippines initiated the longest lockdown in the world, and since its economy relies heavily on services sector, therefore it suffered the greatest contraction by as much as 11%. Also, Alt Simplified harps again on the folly of protectionism and calls upon the government to finally drop it. And if only the government had done this much earlier, then perhaps it would have been not as lagging behind as it is right now, and that it could have been or it would have benefited more on the promise of an Asian tiger as much as it should have been after World War II. Lastly, that the Philippines should bank on its BPO industry being one of the bright spots in a somewhat overcast economy. Now, this has been the summary of the presentation of Alt Simplified concerning the Philippine economy, which he entitled The Economy of the Philippines, Asian Tiger or Underperformer. The question now is, are all these things the things he stated and listed the truth, or should it be simply taken with a grain of salt? Well, contrary to some of the assertions made in the video of Alt Simplified concerning the Philippine economy, the political economy and history of the Philippines was not exactly covered the way Alt Simplified covered it. In short, it was actually half the truth. Yes, it is half the truth. So, let's tackle. On the main points, the following assertions are made. 1. The Philippine economy has the second highest GDP per capita next to Japan after the Second World War. That was true, but it did not mean that it was a product of a booming industrialization. The Philippine economy cannot be compared to Japan in any given time. Japan was already an industrial powerhouse capable of not only creating powerful war machines, but in fact, it really did use these war machines to buttress US in that war, the Second World War. While at that time, the Philippines was still an agricultural country, a colony of the US at that, and one that suffered the destruction of the war. We can check YouTube to find out if it is true, or if these things really happened to the Philippines during that war to find out. And guess what? It did. Number 2, that the Philippines has the second most modern manufacturing sector also next to Japan after the Second World War. Now this is a big lie. Being a colony of a more powerful country coming from an agricultural based economy that was destroyed in the war, then being given independence right after the war itself, come on, where is the common sense there? We can check YouTube still and try to find out if the Philippines really has that second most modern manufacturing sector next to Japan after the war, in spite of those things that happened after the war. We can check YouTube and yes, we can find out if it was or if it was not. Number 3, that the Philippines was supposedly the first Asian tiger that has since fallen from the Asian tiger race. This is also a lie. This is a hoax. A big lie at that. Though it was true that indeed the GDP of the Philippines grew to a promising rate after the war, but it didn't mean it was the result of booming industrialization, and that the Philippine economy experienced a modern manufacturing sector next to Japan a few years after the same war. Since the benchmark of Alt Simplified to be categorized as a tiger economy is the level of industrialization and the status of the manufacturing sector of that given economy, then the Philippines was and has never been a tiger economy, especially a few years or even 5 or even 10 years after that war. It never passed through any level of industrialization. nor was it able to modernize its manufacturing sector. Thus so, in the hope to understand why it was that way, Alt Simplified simply attributed it to the idea that the Philippine economy supposedly took a different model of economic development, in the sense that instead of modernizing and developing its manufacturing sector enough for it to traverse the income curve, the service sector supposedly and apparently grew rapidly without making a dent on the income levels, thus making the service sector oddly the largest sector of the economy by the 1980s. And without the manufacturing sector providing the necessary jobs for people. But the sad part is that Alt Simplified attributes it again to the government's policy of protectionism without really understanding if there really was protectionism or no protectionism at that. Or if the policy of protectionism he was harping really happened in the Philippine economy or not. Especially those days. Well, I'll simplify, or perhaps the data or the source of the data he used to present these things are misinforming people, and they are wrong. But we will not discuss this yet now, because for now we will try to continue with the other points that he discussed in the video before we can rebut them all. So, number 4, I'll simplify stated that the Philippine economy has suffered a debt default since the 1980s but has since slowly recovered. This thing did happen, indeed, and the event that triggered it was the assassination of Senator Benigno Aquino in 1983. He was former President Marcos' main political rival for the presidency, and his assassination in 1983 caused the financial system to wobble. The Philippine National Bank, the country's main public bank, after the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas, suffered a major bank run, and that the government had to bail it out, and the fund had to be secured again as a debt from the IMF World Bank. And it was done through both a default payment system as well as an extended fund facility. This was the one Miss Karen Hudes has been peddling on YouTube. If I'll simplify knew Miss Karen Hudes, I think she was the country manager of the IMF during that time, or she was someone who holds a high position, who held a high position in the IMF World Bank in the Philippines at that time. So perhaps I'll simplify, can check Miss Karen Hudes and the story she was peddling concerning this. And then number 5, that the Philippines has poorly executed its economic reforms, contributing to why it was lagging behind its neighbors in terms of attracting foreign direct investment. This may be true, but it's vague. Economic reforms may pertain to a plethora of policies. The question is, which of them are we wanting to adjust? And then number 6, that the Philippines has suffered from many political assassinations and unrest, contributing to its unattractiveness in the past. Well, of course, and aside from that, the Philippines has one of the freest media in the world, a media willing to bash its own people and government and to peddle the most sensational story and lies of all time that they can find just to beat the competition. And yes, of course, for the money. And then number 7, that the Philippines was the worst performer among its peers in 2020. It initiated the longest lockdown and suffered the biggest contraction. Congratulations! Now, in trying to understand more the reasons behind these 7 main points it listed, Alt-Simplified provided further the following reasons. First, because the Philippines has a high political instability in its history. Well, that's true. Second, that it has a long history of protectionism and import substitution after the war. Now, this was wrong. This so-called policy of protectionism and import substitution did happen, but he was discussing it on a wrong pretext. Let's discuss. It's this. The policy of this IMF World Bank narrative, which Alt-Simplified is peddling, which would not be visible somehow if we are just going to base it on YouTube videos presented by, let's say, the US military or by foreign foundations or correspondents who took part in that war, because they would only show their viewpoint. In short, it does not come from the experience of the primary people, respondents to the case. Now, the Philippines, both Manila and the provinces, were ravaged by the war, the Second World War. There was no economy or no industry in it to begin with. Worse, it was to be given independence by virtue of a law approved in 1934. That law created the 1935 Commonwealth government, in which the Philippines was allowed to exist for 10 years before granting it full independence with or without the war, practically by 1945 or 1946. It was unfortunate that World War II occurred and the Philippines was devastated. The U.S. Congress saw what was necessary to rehabilitate and restore the Philippines before giving it independence. Thus, the War Rehabilitation Act was made into law. The War Rehabilitation Act approved the release of around $560 million for the rehabilitation of the Philippines, but it was not a standalone fund. Before granting it, U.S. High Commissioner to the Philippines, Paul V. McNutt, or Diplomat Paul V. McNutt, ensured that the two initial or preliminary laws would be signed by the incoming Philippine President Manuel Rojas first. The prerequisite laws were: 1. The Philippine Trade Act, also known as the Belt Trade Act, and then 2. The U.S.-Philippine Treaty on General Relations. The Philippine Trade Act or Belt Trade Act would govern the policies on trade and economy between the U.S. and the Philippines, while the Treaty on General Relations would govern other aspects of the post-war U.S.-Philippine relations. The major provisions of the Philippine Trade Act includes exclusive engagement of the Philippine economy with the U.S. economy through import-export of goods. Next, the preferential tariff on goods exported by the U.S. to the Philippines. Next, the parity rights or unhampered ownership and use of land and resources by American individuals and companies in the Philippines. And finally, pegging the exchange rate between the dollar and the peso to a fixed 1-to-2 exchange rate. The Philippine President Manuel Rojas agreed to all these provisions just so the independence would be granted and the 560 million US dollar War Rehabilitation Fund would be released. The $560 million War Rehabilitation Fund was not only used to rehabilitate and restore the Philippines, but it was also used to jumpstart the Philippine economy after the war. Along with the reconstruction of Manila, the people the people of the Philippines once again started their lives and started doing their enterprises. One of the biggest impacts of the economic activity created by the rehabilitation of Manila was on the migration of people. Rural people whose livelihoods were disrupted by the war took the opportunity to participate in the reconstruction, and the result was the gradual migration of rural folks to the cities. They were in fact the first people to comprise the shanty towns that grew beside the areas of Manila that were reconstructed. That was why the biggest slums in Manila, as well as the old dump site called Smoky Mountain, could be found in Tondo district, the oldest part of the city. Now, those who thought of pegging the exchange rate of the dollar to the peso on a fixed 1-to-2 rate while keeping the flow of exports and imports free flowing thought the idea was good. Being an industrial economy itself, the U.S. exports to the Philippines goods that require higher capital expenditure. On the other hand, the Philippines, being an agricultural economy itself that exports to the U.S. agricultural products such as tobacco, abaca, coconut, cane sugar, as well as handicraft products, only require cheap labor for its goods. The trade imbalance between goods that require high capital expenditure versus goods that require cheap labor in a fixed currency exchange rate was the culprit why the GDP per capita of the Philippines grew remarkably high during the first 10 years after the war. Yes, this is the reason. It was the imbalance between the goods that require high capital expenditure versus goods that require cheap labor in a fixed currency exchange rate caused the GDP of the Philippines within 10 years after the war to grow remarkably high. But then, since one of the provisions stipulated in the Treaty of General Relations between the U.S. and the Philippines is the no competition clause, they had to keep the agricultural mode of production of the Philippine economy as is. This in order that the Philippine goods would not compete with incoming American goods. This was the reason why the Philippine economy did not industrialize and remained agricultural for the longest time. It took 10 years for American manufacturers involved with Philippine trade to complain and realize they were at a disadvantage in the system they created. They sought audience with the administration of the administration of President Ramon Magsaysay to change some of the provisions of the Philippine Trade Act or the Bell Trade Act. Since President Magsaysay was somehow ambivalent of the idea, he allowed an outsider to his administration. Former President Jose Laurel, who was the puppet president of the Philippines during the Japanese period. President Magsaysay allowed former President Jose Laurel to handle the negotiations with the Americans. Although former President Laurel was not part of his government. So on September 6, 1955, on the insistence of the Americans, former President Jose Laurel and American diplomat James M. Langley signed a treaty that replaced or amended the Philippine Trade Act, also known as the Belt Trade Act, with a newer treaty called the Laurel-Langley Agreement. The Laurel-Langley Agreement did not change much of the provisions of the Philippine Trade Act. It still retained the preferential tariff on imported U.S. products. It also still retained the parity rights, but this time it was open to both sides, Philippines and U.S. side. It still allowed open currency transfers on both sides, but most of all, and most important of all, it lifted the 1 to 2 dollar to peso fixed exchange rate and allowed the currency exchange to float. So it is now a floating rate. From the former 1 to 2 fixed rate, now they allowed the floating rate in between the dollar and peso, and they allowed it to be dictated by the balance of trade, by the free flow of supply and demand. Now, since U.S. goods coming to the Philippines are capital goods, or that they require high capital expenditure, while goods that are exported by the Philippines to the U.S. are mostly agricultural goods and products that require cheap labor, such as the handicrafts and cottage industry products, local manufacturers started to pay more their dollar reserve. And so, their dollar reserve started to deplete. The value of the peso against the dollar started to drop because it was already pegged into a floating rate. And the Philippine economy started to incur deficit. This all began when the Philippine Trade Act or Belt Trade Act signed in 1946 was replaced by the Laurel-Langley Agreement signed on September 6, 1955. This was the reason why the Philippine GDP started to plummet down after a 10-year rise since 1946. Not only did the Laurel-Langley Agreement change the economic environment between the U.S. and the Philippines, but it was also through this agreement that the Philippines was introduced to the IMF World Bank. The IMF World Bank rode on the vehicle of the Laurel-Langley Agreement. It was actually the due diligence feedback or propaganda of the IMF World Bank when they trumpeted the idea that the Philippines was second only to Japan in terms of economic development in the years succeeding the Second World War, and it was created to build confidence between the agency and its client nation, but soon after a regime of foreign debt was started, and this is the one being harped by the alt-simplified video. So, soon enough, the local Filipino manufacturers, the agricultural exporters, and the handicraft manufacturers who complained to President Magsaysay, who suffered the backlash of the new trade relations, who complained to President Ramon Magsaysay, had found an audience with him. Former President Ramon Magsaysay actually responded to them. In the first place, he was already ambivalent with the agreement they tried to hatch, namely the Laurel-Langley Agreement, and now that the affected Filipino manufacturers already were complaining to him, he was compelled to respond to them. And that was when, as a response to them, he put in place the policy of import substitution, the one Alt-Simplified was trying to mention. But then, President Magsay's military advisor, the CIA operative Colonel Edward Lansdale, argued with him regarding the wisdom of that policy. The next thing the Filipino people knew was President Ramon Magsaysay died in a mysterious plane crash on March 17, 1957. Whatever the cause of that, let's leave it to God. But President Ramon Magsaysay died without finishing his term of office. His Vice President, Carlos P. Garcia, who succeeded him and then went on to establish his own term of office, tried to modify President Magsaysay's policy of import substitution. Perhaps he feared what might happen to him. And so instead of doing the import substitution policy, what President Carlos Garcia did was he tried to call it a Filipino First policy. But the Filipino First policy was actually more of a slogan. It was not a policy, but it was a slogan. He just encouraged everybody to patronize Filipino product first without creating any policy in relation to it. So it was more of a slogan or a state of mind rather than a government policy on trade. So, contrary to Alt-Simplified's claim that the Philippines had a long history of protectionism, it was wrong and false, and it was actually the contrary. Secondly, the policy of import substitution that he was saying started now only in 1956, not after the Second World War, and those who clamored for it were Filipino agricultural exporters and handicraft manufacturers and those who are involved in the cottage industry who were hurting because their dollar reserve started to be depleted as they start to pay more after the peso dollar fixed rate was lifted and changed into the floating rate. This was the effect of the Laurel-Langley Agreement. What Alt-Simplified was harping was actually the IMF World Bank narrative that came in the Philippines after 1955. Now, the third reason Alt-Simplified cited that the price of the Philippine key export, namely coconut products, experienced a general decline in the years that followed after World War II. In this argument alone, he already admitted that the main export of the Philippines, even after the war, was agriculture-based. How then would he still say that the Philippines has the second most modern manufacturing sector next to Japan, after saying that the main export of the Philippines was agriculture-based? What is that? And then number 4, The fourth reason, Alt-Simplified cited that the Philippines only opened some sectors of its economy in the 1960s and 1970s, but then it produced worse results because it jeopardized its own industries that flourished due to import substitution. Supposedly because of the high tariff imposed on capital goods needed to produce new export-oriented industries. It's kind of odd where he was getting this information, or if this was concocted by someone else. In the beginning, Alt Simplified blames the so-called policy of import substitution because it is tantamount to protectionism, and that it was the reason why the Philippines has fallen behind in the Asian tiger race. Yet, contrary to that claim, he says that because of import substitution, there are some sectors of the economy that flourished. And the reason why they died down back then was that the Philippines opened its economy in the 1960s and 1970s, causing the opening to kill those that thrived under the policy of import substitution. That's odd. He was contradicting himself. Now, what makes him far too off, however, was when he said that the industries died because of the high tariff imposed on capital goods. These tariffs are supposedly needed to produce new export-oriented industries. Wow, you are grossly inventing, man. The Lowry-Langley Agreement retained the preferential tariff on incoming U.S. goods until 1974. So it was from 1946 to 1974. So where is that high tariff imposed on capital goods entering the Philippines coming from the U.S. coming from? And then the National Economic Council of the government, Philippine government, now it is called the NEDA. It created the National Cottage Industry Development Authority. Filipinos know this. The NACIDA, the National Cottage Industry Development Authority, is called NACIDA, and placed it under the Department of Commerce and Industries in the 1960s. Now, the Department of Commerce and Industry, it is now named DTI. And this agency, the National Cottage Industry Development Authority, called NACIDA, created in the 1960s, was created precisely to support, develop, to train, to market, to microfinance the type of industry allowed for the Philippines because of the no competition policy on the industries you are talking about. These industries, we call it cottage industries. In other words, they are handicraft products. They are handicraft business. That is where we thrived during those days. Not in the modern manufacturing industry. And then also, you mentioned the shipping industry, which is now a big part of the economy. Well, the shipping industry of the Philippines flourished only in the late 70s, and it has nothing to do with the trade between the US and the Philippines. The shipping industry flourished in the late 70s because of our own necessity within our country, not because it is needed in trade between the US and the Philippines. And then number 5, The fifth reason, I'll simplify, cited that the economy started heavy borrowing in the 1970s, causing it to start depending on foreign debt to finance its growth. Well, that was a given. Like we said, the IMF World Bank came to the Philippines riding on the Laurel-Langley Agreement. In fact, in building the client-agency relationship, they created the due diligence propaganda we are talking about. They said that the Philippines was second only to Japan after the war, blah, blah, blah. And everybody took a bite on it, including your video presentation, all simplified. The IMF World Bank did not even consider that it took some years before the Philippines or before the destroyed Manila really recovered from the war. Our first commercial district, now being called Central Business District, but back then it was called Commercial District. It was the Carriedo Santa Cruz Avenida area. This place is famous. The Carriedo Santa Cruz Avenida area. This was our first commercial district. And it flourished only in the 1960s. Not in 1946, not in the 1950s. It was in fact one of the beneficiaries of the $560 million War Rehabilitation Fund released by the U.S. Congress in 1946 and 1947. The IMF World Bank, in making its faulty due diligence propaganda, also did not consider that the Philippine economy was not really industrial. Even now, even right now, you can go outside the cities, outside Metro Manila and the major cities of the Philippines, and you can see how agricultural still it is. Although the Philippines became a member of the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development in 1945, which was the progenitor of the World Bank, but it was not until the tie-up of the IMF World Bank became formal that the Philippines got its first loan and infrastructure project in 1957, specifically the Binga Dam project. The sixth reason that Alt Simplified cited was that by the early 80s, investors started capital flight, resulting in the debt payment default, thus stunting the economic growth, making the Philippines miss the so-called Asian tiger mark. True, that is true, massive capital flight out of the country happened in the early 80s, but was it due to the policy of protectionism of the government, or perhaps due to the faulty economic policies imposed by the government? Wrong. The capital flight in the 80s was due to the political instability and the specter of a bloody revolution that occurred during that time. Former President Ferdinand Marcos had just came from the US in 1982 and had just assured Ronald Reagan, the American president, and the American policymakers there that everything was all right in spite of the communists gaining ground and Mindanao being torn apart by Muslim rebellion. Then here, in 1983, the only thorn in his neck, former Senator Benigno Aquino coming home to rekindle their rivalry, suddenly being assassinated right at the tarmac, at the airport. The Philippines almost collapsed overnight. And when the fallen senator was paraded in the streets of Manila during his funeral, It was almost a revolution. The banking system almost crashed. The government had to borrow more funds from the IMF World Bank to bail out the Philippine National Bank, the country's main public bank. How will the economy not suffer? And how could capital flight not occur with all these events? But then it was not because of protectionism or import substitution or whatever faulty government policies were imposed. It was due to the political instability at that time. No more, no less. The seventh reason that Alt-Simplified cited was, again, the government policy of protectionism, which accordingly did not went away. Now, to clarify everything about this misinformation, this policy of protectionism was indeed implemented by the Philippine government, but it only started in 1978, not in 1946, not in 1955, not in 1960s, not even at the beginning of the 1970s, but in 1978. Why 1978? Well, it was in 1978 when former President Marcos got his political mandate and supposedly won the election in spite his martial law was still imposed in the Philippines at that time. It was in that year when he opened and inaugurated the country's parliament called the Interim Batasang Pambansa, our present Congress. It was former President Ferdinand Marcos who opened and inaugurated it in 1978. And when he inaugurated it, he also launched his political party called the KBL, or the New Society Movement. Using the state security forces and the dominant political party under him, he launched the New Society in the Philippines. And the most prominent economic policy or activity he did was when he created an economic system called crony capitalism. It was in 1978 that former President Ferdinand Marcos came up with an economic system called crony capitalism. What was crony capitalism? What was it that he started in 1978? Well, he took that model from the Emperor Meiji of Japan during the Meiji Restoration. The emperor created what was called the Zaibatsu, which propelled Japan to industrialization when the Philippines was still a colony of the US. That also was the same idea that helped South Korea to become what it is today, and they call it Chaebol. What was that? It was the idea that the government can create its own group of conglomerates or industrialists that could or who could usher its own program of industrialization by protecting it from outside competition during its development. In short, the state or government will nationalize certain industries it finds strategic or key in its own industrialization. Of course, it is a no-no. It is a no-no in a free market economy. That is why Alt Simplified has been beating at it in its video or in his video. And yes, there are other ways a country can industrialize other than doing the protectionism, doing the saibatsu, or doing the cable. But it's wrong for alt simplified to beat on it and say it was the cause of Philippine economic woes because it did not prosper during the time former President Marcos tried to create it or tried to do that policy in 1978. Again, that policy of protectionism, which Alt Simplified was harping, started only in the Philippines in 1978 by former President Ferdinand Marcos. It was not in 1946, not in the 1950s, or not in the 1980s, not even when Marcos imposed martial law in 1972. It was only in 1978 when he created that thing we call crony capitalism under his new society. But then when he did that, the US was alarmed. The US was alarmed and they started asking him, what are you doing with the Philippines? How about our trade relations with you? So, in order to appease them, in September 1982, former President Ferdinand Marcos had to bring to the US his entire government machinery and to meet former President Ronald Reagan and the other top policymakers of the US for the basic reason that they need to allay their fears concerning what he was doing to the Philippines. But of course, in 1982, the assassination of Senator Aquino happened. No, in 1983, the assassination of former Senator Benigno Aquino happened. He came in the US in 1982, and in 1983, all hell broke loose. So, they all ran out of time. They were run over by history. Now,